Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. On popular demand, I have with me Professor Dipankar Sengupta from the University of Jammu. Sir, you've picked up quite a fan base amongst my little geopolitical community, if I may say that. The views last time about where the economies are headed and this and that, of course, was an eye opener for me because we one knows that there is a connection between geopolitics and economy, but one doesn't kind of put that into play because the geopolitical angle of it is normally always put across as military strength, as diplomatic strength, and as this and that. But it's the economy that stands behind this strength of military and this and the diplomatic heft that one country can have, and that's something that you made us realize last time. Thank you so much, and welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Aadi, for having me.
So the first question, you've got the United States president literally running around, and he cancelled a visit to Australia because the crisis of debt is pretty high. There is obviously the threat of dollar losing its dominance around the world, and he seems to be in a crisis mode right now. Would you like to kind of help us understand, sir, what exactly happened that went wrong in the U.S. economy apart from just the random printing of notes, sir?
Look, I mean, they got their COVID strategy all wrong. I mean, I could go back and I could start that. Look, this started from the George Bush second, who, with his genius, transformed government that was in surplus to a government that was in deficit, and at the end of his 8 years had nothing to show for it except one of the greatest recessions in the history of the United States. I could start from there. But let's come to the immediate problem. The immediate problem was COVID. How did the United States deal with this with COVID? You see, when the system is in lockdown, either government lockdown or because businesses are closing down for obvious reasons, that is not the time you undertake expansionary fiscal policies. That is not the time you basically write out checks to inflate the economy, right? And that is precisely what the United States did. And many of the people who had criticized India for its steps, what did we do? We didn't inflate the economy artificially during that lockdown because we knew that lockdown was not because of a shortage of demand. The contraction of the economy was not because of a shortage of demand. It was because we were closing down our public spaces by law, by fiat. So it was not a shortage of demand. It was basically by regulation. So when you do that, you don't try to expand your economy by spending money left, right, and center. That time, what we did to save the most vulnerable sections, we gave them food, rations. We did some DBT, but it was aimed for the weakest sections so that they would not starve. And else what we did was basically expansion of credit. We didn't spend money left, right, and center. But the United States did precisely that. And in so doing, they didn't inflate the economy while when there was COVID was going on. All this excess liquidity has now come to bite it. You know, and now you have record high inflation, and although joblessness seems to have fallen, this record high inflation is really biting into the incomes of the United States middle class, and a lot of people are actually no longer calling themselves middle class. They're falling into some sort of a poverty now. So what you did, you tried to spend yourself out of trouble. Now you've run into a debt ceiling. Now look, this debt ceiling business, in my opinion, where the United States is concerned, is a self-imposed ceiling. And the United States can actually do away with that, and they should do away with this. This is an artificial ceiling. I'm not too sure what it actually does. Okay. Now they say they are in a crisis because some dissenting Democrats will say, look, we've gone too far, stop this. I'm not too sure that the United States at this point in time can actually turn around and keep its expenditure within that particular debt. Somewhere down the line, they'll have to control it, no doubt about it. But at this point in time, I'm not too sure any political party, certainly not a Democratic president, can afford to obey this particular debt ceiling because it curtails his power to spend. So, at a time when inflation is sky high, he doesn't want employment to go down. He has to choose between one of the two levels: high employment, which he has, high inflation, which he has. Now, if he starts cutting down, inflation will not come down in a jiffy, but it will affect employment. And therefore, he is loath to do anything on this particular front. He wants that debt ceiling to go away.
It's a self-inflicted wound. Would you know?
Everything that the United States has done from 2002 to 1 onwards has been self-inflicted.
So
There
would
was
you
a
also
brief time, yeah.
please, sir.
See, right now they had a crisis of oil. You see, after Trump lost, the Democrats, I thought, would have brought Iran back into the JCPOA and ensured that Iranian oil would have kept flowing. But they
Hmm.
didn't do that also. So you basically inherited the, a one mistake of Trump, and instead of rectifying it, you persisted with it. Therefore, the United States has only itself to blame. So see, so it's repeated mistakes after mistakes after mistakes, and here is where the United States is. It's alienated Russia. It's thrown Russia into the arms of China. Okay, it's created one enemy too many, and it expects India also join United States in creating enemies of people who have been rather dependent allies, so to speak.
Would you bunch in the European Union within this particular syndrome as well, sir? Because the symptoms of the European Union are pretty much the same today. Uh,
The,
Germany does
I
seem to be a bit
okay.
stronger, but
Possibly on the Ukrainian front, the European Union is far more united. I mean, the major powers that give the European Union coherence are possibly united. You will have individual European nations here and there breaking ranks or urging Zelensky to make peace and all that sort of a thing. But on Ukraine, United States, the Europe is united. When it comes to Iran, that thing seems to break down. When it comes to China, also China and Europe is too invested in China and vice versa, for them to basically go all gung ho against China. Although somewhere down the line, I think the Europeans will also start diversifying their global chains in order to ensure that they don't have all their eggs into the Chinese basket.
mm,
But I won't say that the problems of the European Union are that deep, uh, at least where economics is concerned, as say compared to the United States.
so the US. One of the interesting thing is that today we find that the amount of population which is actually coming into the US, it's funny that they're not stopping it. They've got some people say it's about 2 million people, some people say it's about 1.3, 1.4, whatever it may be. I mean, it's a large chunk of people looking at the population for US. A lot of people have this theory that they want to get this population to ensure that they become the working population because their own working population is reducing, and they want to ensure that social credit is kind of kept up, the social payments are kept up, and stuff like that. In any case and scenario, so one of the biggest things that I want to ask you, what is with this population increase that even the Europeans are trying to do to kind of hedge their economy on? What is it that they're trying to do? Pitch against a bad demographic session, or what is it, sir?
I think the problems of Europe and the problems of United States where demographics is concerned is different. Europe, in a sense, is aging. Italy is a very good example of a very aging population. So what happens is um, the number of people retiring after some time becomes higher than the number of laborers coming in. So your labor force starts to shrink. You have a large population that has to be supported with respect to pensions and a smaller number of people working for it. China is hitting that also. By the way,
Hmm.
it's not just Europe and Europe, it's also China. You see, the one child policy has its consequences. Japan is also hitting it. So Europe has a different problem. Where the United States is concerned, United States replacement rate, in a sense, ensures that it has a stable to a slightly rising population. Okay. Uh, And the United States, for a long time, has been a country of immigrants. And in the 1990s, when the economy was expanding, and if you could walk, you had a job, and you had a job when inflation was also low, the Clinton years, which seem golden now, all these things would not have been problems. But in the middle, given the fact that the United States really did not grow, real wages stagnated, and especially when it comes to unskilled labor. So, when you have Latin American immigration coming into the United States, you get all sorts of signals coming in. Look, uh, um, people become insular, people become, you could say, racist, whatever it is. You see, so the Republicans, in a sense, are clearer on this. They say, you have to come in through legal means. The Democrats will not say you come in through illegal means, but again, they obfuscate the issue by accusing the Republicans of racism, etc., etc. And then they, at the lower levels, they say come in anyway. Okay, right now, given the economic travails of the United States, okay, immigration, in a sense, is automatically related to racism, or immigration, or immigration is related to economic problems. Now, you could argue right now that employment is a record low. But I think right now, the opposition to immigration or welcoming immigration has nothing to do with real wages. I think what it has to do with right now is, and we have to look at data at a more granular level, is to ensure, that the Democrats at least want to ensure that in certain key states, their vote share, in a sense, actually goes up, because these people who come in have a tendency to vote for Democrats for very good reasons. And here, I think shoring up your voter base, shoring up your support group, which also wants these people to come in, is also extremely important. Because the kind of lawlessness that you see along the United States border, southern border, it's crazy. It's crazy. That a sovereign country should allow this to happen. You know, one that basically tries to portray strength. This can only happen if there is a certain kind of partisan politics going on. Otherwise, it could not have happened.
It's really interesting that there is an economic reason behind actually doing this game. So let's talk about the US outflows and the commitments of the US. So with 800 military bases, of course, the amount of commitments that you have is huge. You've got an active war, and previously the difference between this war and the other wars are that the other wars were low intensity combat. Low intensity combat does not consume that much ammunition, does not consume that much manpower in terms of lives. It does not have that kind of fire ratio and stuff like that. So your high tech weapons can actually work. So you need to produce more. So there's a requirement of actually that kind of spending today to kind of ensure that their military might is maintained around the world with both the adversaries. You've got the Chinese on one side and you've got the Russians on the other side. Where do you think this economic situation is headed with sustained required outflows which are fixed for the US today, sir?
If you look at the United States military commitments, they're out of Afghanistan. They're also out of Iraq. So if you look at their actions, they are at the margins. But yes, they want to maintain a mighty presence. Okay. To a great extent, maintaining this kind of a presence, A, requires commitment, political will, which they have demonstrated, but it also requires a strong economy. You know, after all, this has to be paid for by taxes. And it's only when the economy grows that you are able to do this. Now, when it comes to new weaponry, I think the United States, that the desire of the United States and its resolve to be the most powerful military in the world, able to take on its antagonists in any part of the world, I think that will is still undiminished. That capacity in the technical sense is also undiminished. But when it comes to strategy, the United States is woefully inadequate. Let me give you the example of Afghanistan, where it, it basically built a Afghan army, armed it, and it turned out to have basically, it turned out to be a straw army. And let us compare it to the 1987 Afghan regime headed by Najibullah after the Soviets had withdrawn. The Najib government, with a fraction of the resources that the US supported government of Afghanistan had, was able to keep the Mujahideen at bay and thrash them. I remember in 1988 when the Mujahideen invaded, Jalalabad, he was able to raise the siege of Jalalabad and push them back into Pakistan. Why did Najib fall? He did not fall because the Mujahideen defeated him. He fell because there were internal divisions. The United Nations sowed in confusion. He ran out of money. And he never had money to begin with. Now, this is something that the Soviets, in a sense, had managed. They had basically set up an army. There was also a political formation with an organic connect. But that is something that the United States just refused to learn. I mean, one of the things I would have done, what would have been to strengthen Dostam. Dostam was Najibullah's strong arm. And Dostam enabled the United States to come in at the initial phases of its anti-Taliban campaign. But then the United States chose to sideline or marginalize him. Who did they crop up? Who knows? Men of straw who had actually never fought. And the United States paid the consequence. So it is bad strategy on behalf of the United States, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, which in a sense shows them up to be weak and indecisive. That is the United States problem. Even in Afghanistan, they listened to Pakistan more than they should, and they paid the consequence. Right now, of course, the irony is they've withdrawn from Afghanistan, and Pakistan is now left holding that particular baby. And one feels sorry to see what's happening to Pakistan.
So I wonder who's holding who in terms of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So today, that's another game. So,
Yeah.
but just the last question on the US before I actually move on to China, and this third segment will be how do we safeguard ourselves. I think that's going to be one of the most important thing with this whole, for the lack of a better word, tamasha going around. At least it's important that India kind of holds its own. So the US today also, has tried to interlink itself, or with the Europeans in terms of trying to create a China policy. Uh, it is trying to cut off China from various resources. It is trying to do a whole lot of damage to the Chinese with regards to uh, microchips and this and that and the other. You will also have the Chinese retaliation coming to them, and that we know is not going to be easy for the US to kind of take forth. And we've seen some of that coming across. How do you think the US is going to hedge against that, sir? Because at the end of it, an Indian retaliation or a European retaliation, whatever said and done, the Chinese have a large economy. So that retaliation is going to hurt. How do you think they're going to hedge themselves against a Chinese backlash in terms of economy?
Look, where the Chinese is concerned, the Chinese economy is very much dependent on the United States market. The largest surplus or the largest deficit the US has and the largest surplus the Chinese have is vis-a-vis United States economy. The United States will basically act at the margins. It will act in higher technology areas. For a long time, look, this is a self-created problem. For a long time, the Chinese entered the WTO and they were able to violate IPR laws with impunity.
Mhm.
And this was a strange game where the United States government looked the other way and the United States corporations also looked the other way, hoping against hope that somewhere down the line that the Chinese would clean up their act and they would get access to the Chinese market. Now look, the Chinese want to transform their economy from a manufacturing economy into a high-tech service economy as well, as trajectories of economies grow. How on earth did Google and others think that the Chinese would enable them to have beachheads in their own economy and dominate that particular space. The Chinese were always going to steal their technology and create their own national champions to service their service sector. For a long time, the United States, the Europeans thought, this will basically will change. It did not change. And it is only now that they are basically saying, okay, we have to now crack down. But even this is half hearted. Look, if you really wanted to diversify your global chain, especially in high technology areas, you have to be upfront about it, and you have to take countries like India into confidence and saying, look, you will be part of our supply chain. Give the necessary guidance, hints to your corporates. Look, develop India as an alternative source, alternative, source of a variety of goods. Our IPR record, I think, is exemplary. We have been models, and yet, in spite of our model behavior when it comes to IPRs, ever since we joined the WTO, the Europeans for a long time had an ostrich policy vis-a-vis the Chinese, which they are now. I won't say they are waking up yet, because waking up means taking decisions, strategic well
Uh,
thought out decisions.
Sir, sorry, I lost you here. Uh, you said
No, no,
wait.
my the euro. Let me come back. See,
Ha,
you want to basically diversify your supply base. You want to safeguard your technology. You have to basically go in with those economies who respect IPRs, who play by the rules. Even then, I do not see this actually going on. I know European major, I mean, you have the odd Foxconn investment, Apple investment, etc. Know about it, because at least one economy, one company has that we want to basically, save ourselves. We had better base ourselves in an economy which plays by the rules. Okay, but that movement, I do not see it happening as fast as it should. The European companies still think, okay, China is a good place basically to do business with. They will possibly turn to India later on, by which time, the Chinese will have basically made a beachhead by stealing their technology in their areas as well. They're doing it very, very fast. Okay. But the Europeans have always been like this, ambivalent. So they are doing certain things, but I do not see the kind of strategizing that requires. You see, it's not just government acting; it's also government basically telling their corporates to, in the name of national security, diversify. But the problem with wokeism is the following: it's not just in the United States government; it's also in the corporations. I mean, Google was asked, you know, about Chinese IPR, and their answers were woke, possibly out of self-interest because they thought that the Chinese would give them some leeway. But American technological corporations, especially the non-hardware corporations, have a tendency to be woke. You know, depending on the their workforce is comes from a particular milieu that supports this particular culture, and they say stupid things and they do stupid things. Okay, under those circumstances, you have to wait for these companies to get more damaged before they start smelling the coffee. Uh, Hopefully, by that time, they will be still around, to invest in India. Remember, in those sectors, technological obsolescence is very, very fast. 20 years ago, that Nokia would cease to exist. Did anybody think that? But Nokia has ceased to exist. So, the window of opportunity for American technological companies, European technology companies, I would argue, is extremely limited.
That's a you know you basically touched upon a factor that these guys did not change with the times. They didn't bring about the kind of changes that were required. They didn't actually this thing, and the whole woke thought process, I absolutely agree with you, which is actually not profitable, if I may say that, sir. Let's switch to China, sir. China is interesting. The kind of reports that are coming out of the Chinese recovery. Today, the Chinese are talking about no, the recovery is a bit slow, this, that, the other. Their export import figures have not shown the kind of bulge that was expected out of China. The oil prices around the world have largely remained stable, which a lot of people had said once the Chinese economy opens, it's going to go through the roof. When the OPEC cut the what do you call the production levels,
Supply.
everybody said, "Oh God, this is going to be a problem." And this, but the Chinese economy is still sputtering. It's not started up. What do you see out of this particular aspect of the Chinese economy? Because the expectancy was completely different.
Look, if the Chinese and those who love the Chinese economy still think that the Chinese can still hold on to an export led growth strategy, they are mistaken. I mean, before 2010, I would have said, okay. But as the economy grows, and the Chinese economy has grown, when it becomes that large, to expect export led growth to the rest of the world economy, which is relative to the Chinese economy not as large as it used to be, is a strategy that cannot work because it expects that the rest of the world to also grow. Now, if you look at the Chinese economic policies, these are beggar my neighbor policies. That I will export to you, but I will not allow you to export to me.
Huh.
You know, uh, Largely, you see, you have a trade surplus of $800 billion right now. Okay. And it's not helping you one bit because you cannot, at that particular point in time, expect that foreign consumption you know, will take on the role which domestic consumption is supposed to take up. That's not happening. If you look at Chinese inequality over the years, it's risen very, very fast. Okay, during Mao's time, it was practically absolute equality. Now you have a Gini coefficient which is 0.46, which is actually very, very high. Okay, now under those circumstances, it is very clear that consumption, at least when it comes to the working classes, the largest segment of the Chinese population is concerned, is pretty moderate. And as I said earlier on this show, the Chinese have never shown any income doubling plans, so to speak, whereby they could raise domestic incomes and therefore domestic consumption would rise. They've never done that. You cannot rely, a large economy cannot rely on beggar thy neighbor policies to keep on growing. But again, here it's quite possible that in the Chinese, for the Chinese government, growth in a sense is subservient to some other factors. Again, I'm not too sure. Again, I'm not too sure. See, if the Chinese were to allow growth, okay, or allow imports, what would happen? Other countries would grow, and if other countries grow, they would buy more Chinese goods. If I am allowed to export to China, my incomes rise. As my incomes rise, I also can import more from China.
Bye. Yes.
This is basically how symbiosis reciprocality works. But that is not how the Chinese basically do it. And by the way, this protectionism is not being led by Chinese corporates, Chinese companies. It's a Chinese government thing.
Yeah.
In the 80s, the Japanese government, backed by the Japanese corporates, had these kind of mercantilist policies. Okay, but here it's the Chinese government. It does not even have popular support. I talked to you about pharmaceuticals, how Indian pharmaceuticals, in a sense, are being kept out to the detriment of the Chinese people. And there's a movie about it also in China, which was a great hit, ironically.
The funny part about the Chinese economy, and you've hinted at it, sir. And if I may articulate it, and I'd really request your comment. You said that the controls over the Chinese economy is something to do with something else. Now, may I
Hmm.
articulate that? Is the factor that it is like the Chinese Communist Party would rather be in power of a China that does not become a superpower, but rather not lose power of a China that becomes a superpower.
Okay, the Chinese Communist Party would rather be in power of a superpower. They believe
Yeah, of course.
that
Yeah, I
they've managed growth well enough to be a superpower. They are a superpower. They are certainly an economic superpower, a military superpower. But at the end of the day is the fact that the Chinese party, the Chinese Communist Party, must be the top boss. I cannot have an economy growing in a manner where there are alternative sources of power. I cannot have that. I need to be in control. I need to control a lot of things. Now, initially, during Tang Xiaoping's time, the idea was okay, let us keep low, let us not make noise, let us grow. Our time will come. This lot thinks that their time has come. Okay, now actually to show, flex their muscles, show their teeth, to basically project power.
Hmm.
Okay, I believe they may have acted prematurely. I believe they have acted prematurely. Okay, and who knows what will happen within the Chinese economy? Okay, if you are not able to grow, if you're not able to grow profitably, companies may start cutting down on their investment. If you start cutting down on your investment, it has a massive impact on domestic demand. Okay, so far among the sources of demand is exports, domestic consumption, and investment, private investment. Private investment to a great extent depends on profitability.
Correct.
If years of bad growth, poor growth affects profitability to the extent that notwithstanding Chinese government guidances, distorted prices, etc., etc., companies start to curb their investment and they do it all at the same time, and the Chinese economy goes into a tailspin, you never know what will happen. You never know what will happen. With a economy so vast as theirs, trying to micromanage or trying to do an indicative planning kind of a thing, you know, may not succeed. And it could lead the Chinese economy into directions which neither China nor the rest of the world wants.
I mean, you brought out something really, really amazing, that there is a country which might be on a factor of a complete collapse at any time, but they
Look,
are stable because of their strength and the width of the economy.
look, collapsing means what? It's not that as the
It's
factories
not
are
that the
going
country
to
falls.
vanish
No.
overnight.
Yeah. No.
No, the question is basically going into a recession.
The system collapses. Yes, sir.
You're going into a recession. And how do you get out of that particular recession? See, there are some recessions you can get out of by
Yeah.
spending more, but there are certain recessions where if investors believe, if pessimism catches on, becomes very, very strong, no
Yeah.
matter what you do, it becomes very hard to reflate the economy. Okay. Now, so far, they have a nice propaganda machine within and without China, outside China, who's been basically beating the drum, etc., etc. And given their post-COVID recovery growth of 8%, they everybody said, okay, shuru ho gaya hai. Subsequently, we know what has happened. Okay, how did it happen? It's happened because there are limits to export-led growth. It's happened because domestic incomes, in a sense, are not being expanded in a manner which the Japanese did during the 50s and 60s income doubling plan. They're not doing it. It appears that the Chinese Communist Party, some super bosses, super geniuses, are trying to micromanage investment also. Some sort of an indicative planning. And I think you are seeing the consequences of that.
Amazing. I must say this last answer, this last minute has been quite eye-opening for a budding China watcher like myself, because I'm always trying to see what are the indications that the Chinese are giving today with regards to distress within the country. You talk about this is my last question on China. So food security is a problem. The real estate is a problem. Food security, why? Because the government has now decided to basically capture all the farmland and convert it to rice paddy fields. So there's a reason why they're doing that. Governments or kingdoms or whatever you want have fallen in China because of three reasons: external influence and a lack of food. So they're scared of that.
Yeah,
You talked about internal consumption economy, which is not there. That means the disposable income is reducing within China. You've got a country where the real estate sector, which is in trouble, which is where a lot of Chinese actually store their wealth. People who have a little bit, you know. So
yeah,
these are the three factors, and then the fourth one is, of course, the global decoupling, which is the Chinese belligerence. Now, all these four things can actually be surmised into a nice little packaging, which will present to you the Chinese economy. Now, these are not something that one country can back off from, sir. I don't see any one of these four factors the Chinese can say, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. Let me just fix myself up first. It's not possible.
look, uh, look, countries sometimes do change. Countries sometimes do change. Okay,
Point taken,
but
sir.
remember, Chinese reform, Chinese economic reform, did not start with the consent of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
Uh, there's a saying in China: the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. Deng Xiaoping was a reformist very early on. But even when he had assumed power in 1981, the Chinese Communist Party, in its 1981 plenum, had criticized all efforts to reform. It is only that the southern provinces didn't listen and they did whatever they had to do. It was success of the southern provinces when it came to agriculture. Parcelization of land. You can say privatization of agriculture, responsibility system, which led to a massive boost in agricultural production, which strengthened the hands of Deng Xiaoping and made reforms an official credo of the Chinese Communist Party. This is how Chinese reforms occurred against the wishes of the party. But that was then, when the Chinese Communist Party, after Mao, was not that strong any longer. This is a Chinese Communist Party on IT steroids. It watches everything, it does everything. So, in a sense, those kinds of rebel action under the radar, in a sense, is not possible. But the fact is, the Chinese, in a sense, can also reform. Look, I believe that the Chinese have the technology and the wherewithal to ensure that with their existing land, they can grow enough food for China. I'm absolutely sure about it. However, given the fact, the manner in which they have distorted their particular prices, some price correction would have to occur. You would have to ensure that food prices are more remunerative for farmers, in a sense, to invest to come within farming. That means higher food prices. That means, given the fact that the incomes of a lot of Chinese have grown far more slowly than the growth rate of China, it would mean reduction in real incomes. And that is something that the Chinese Communist Party is afraid to face up to. One has heard about rebellions, agitations in the lower provinces, but the Chinese, in a sense, have controlled that. Okay, but if it's a widespread thing, then I'm afraid they will be hell to pay. But in my opinion, even that can be controlled by subsidizing food, which would mean that you basically transfer money from one set of resources to agriculture, subsidize food prices. But the Chinese government, in a sense, is even unwilling to do that. Right now, I believe financially the Chinese government can do it even if it borrows, because their debt GDP ratio, at least for the government is concerned, is manageable. But somehow, the Chinese government, in a sense, is yet unwilling to do that. I believe that the Chinese economy, the Chinese farmer, Chinese agriculture is sufficiently resilient to meet Chinese food, vegetables, etc., in a relatively short period of time. But that requires the willingness to accept that there is a problem, number one, which I do not see at all. And secondly, having seen that acceptance, you reform. The problem with communist parties is they claim omniscience, that they know everything. For them to say I have committed a mistake and yet remain in power is not possible. That will possibly happen if Xi Jinping is thrown out. Otherwise, I do not. I see no communist party has accepted its mistakes before throwing out that current lot of leadership.
Yeah.
You know, be it Khrushchev with respect to
Yeah,
Stalin,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
be
yeah,
it
yeah.
Deng Xiaoping with respect to Mao Zedong, you accept mistakes only when that lot is thrown out.
They're gone. So final segment, 5 minutes on how should India protect itself. Of course, we are doing decently well as far as the economy is concerned. My concern is not about the internal economy, sir. The question that I'm asking you is, you elucidated certain points about the US and the China. The Chinese and the US are the largest economies in the world, and if these two are in trouble, it's obviously going to impact us. So
Yeah.
just featuring these two economies, what would you recommend as hard points that India should kind of do to protect itself, sir?
Look, we have to do something about our current account balance, our merchandise trade deficit. One is to expect the world economies to grow and your trade goes along with it. That's business as usual. The other is to supplant or make your presence felt in the supply chains. Okay. I mean, it's amazing that we have a larger population than China, but when it comes to global supply chains and a host of goods, we figure nowhere. So, in a sense, you have to substitute China, you know, in a variety of fields. And I believe our PLI schemes, the productive linked incentive schemes, are a way to go. For a long time, I resisted this particular idea. But given the fact that, our manufacturers are at a massive disadvantage vis-a-vis China, I think if we play this strategically in certain sunrise industries, we will be able to, subsequently, we will be able to move along that particular path. And there is evidence that it's paying us. There is evidence that it's paying us. But, that's the foreign front. We have to get far more better on ease of doing business. Look, you are competing with the rest of the world. So it's no longer enough to say that I am an easier place to do business today than I was 10 years ago. The rest of the world does not care because they have the option of investing and setting up a plant in China as well. You have to compare yourselves to the rest of the world, whether you like it or not. Okay. Look, I see certain states changing themselves. UP is a state that seems to be changing itself rapidly. I wish the other systems, in a sense, were in place. So, for if you look at our major states, Maharashtra, Gujarat, etc., 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 uh, they are possibly easier places to do business. But that fire that existed, at the time of 1991 when we were reforming, that seems to have,
Yeah, yeah.
come down in our growth pole states. In our growth pole states, that I think is alarming. However, having said that, we've gotten some strategic investments. For example, Foxconn, I think, is a strategic investment. We've got some strategic uh, beachheads in certain industries. I think we have to continue on that particular path. I think now it is time we start having candid discussions with European and American and the American governments, with European corporates, etc. Look, this is a chance you cannot afford to miss. You want an alternative supply chain. where infrastructure is available, manpower is available, and more importantly, a predictable legal framework is available, then India is the place to come to.
It's not a win.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, it's fine. You are going to Vietnam and all that sort of a thing. It's okay. But you want something that not just is synergizes with your uh, existing setup, but is also able to contribute intellectually and scientifically without stealing your ideas, then India is the place to come to. Vietnam at this point in time will not be able to do it. Bangladesh will not be able to do it. And the Chinese will rob you blind. This is the signal I think we have to give. It's not just one Ashwini Vaishnav who can do this. We have to have Ashwini Vaishnavs in the various state governments basically having this candid conversations in the company of Indian industrialists talking to Western industrialists. Look, they trusted China, which was foolishness on their part. Not trusting India will be a second foolishness. This, I think, has to be made very clear to these particular companies. We are not asking them to break with China. What are we asking them? That your subsequent expansion plans, India has to figure. So you don't hurt China. You basically start doing business with India. And that I think we have to basically push.
Amazing. Short and crisp, but I think that this is a very hard hitting solution, sir. Professor, I must say, sir, if I was any younger, I would have taken your class. It's an amazing session, sir. And,
Okay.
let me assure you, it's an eye opener for a geopolitical analyst or budding geopolitical analyst. I don't want to even put myself into that analyst, this thing. I'm just an observer, actually.
No,
But
we should all analyze. We should all
for a person
analyze.
like
Look,
me, sir, this sort of an insight actually tells me a lot about how this country is going to behave. When we look at Joe Biden canceling something called the Squad, and India was able to actually enforce on him, no, cancel nahi hoga, bhai. We will do it in Japan. आप आ रहे हो
hmm,
ना उधर पे, we will do it. You can exert that kind of pressure if you know what that guy is going through. If you understand the economy of the country and if you understand the geopolitics that the economy impacts, you should be able to get your little worth out of it. So thank you so much for these insights, sir. I mean, it's always a pleasure listening to you. uh,
pleasure is
and
entirely mine, Adi. Thank you for giving me this time and space.
Arey
In
nahi,
the
sir.
other discussions, I get 10 minutes, 5 minutes, etc., etc., before somebody takes
Sir,
over.
I've
So
I've
this is
said this to you before as well, and I'm saying this to you again. This has to be a long-lasting relationship because economics, the way it is growing right now, and what I want to actually focus the next time is actually focus a little more harder on the Chinese economy. But before I stand up with you on that, I need to do a little more research because I've done a certain amount. I last time I'd sent you some stuff about the trade and this and that. It's a little complicated for me, so I need to really, really read through it before I plan a session with you, sir.
see, Chinese data is always a mystery.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, overstating growth, especially, has always been a problem with all
Oh
communist
yes, oh
economies.
yes, oh
Okay.
yes.
But the fact is, the Chinese economy, in a sense, has grown. What is surprising is the level of distress that still seems to exist in China, even after all these years. Even after all these years, it does not behave like an economy which has the kind of GDP that it has.
Absolutely.
That is a,
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
the mystery.
I absolutely agree with you because they're I mean, everybody says just the last thing that I would like to say: the Chinese have a $225 billion defense budget. When you actually break it down, you realize that the defense budget is about 130 to 140 billion dollars is spent internal security by these security cameras and this and that they put.
Yes,
So the actual defense budget that they're putting across on the defense is about 100. Now, of course, they'll be putting in a lot of hidden funds here and there and stuff like that. And the
of
civil
course, yeah.
military fusion is interesting. So these are the mysteries that one actually, and I think you've got a very good insight into the Chinese history. Also, you mentioned Deng Xiaoping and this and that, which are very interesting to me. So we'll pick it up.
Sure, but
So, you want to say
I've
something?
seen things. We've seen Deng Xiaoping's regime. We've seen China reform before our eyes. This gray in my hair basically tells you that I'm not a young guy any longer. I've seen reforms, so to speak.
Uh, that's what I said. So if I was any younger and going to school or
Uh,
college, I would have taken the class. I'm not anymore, but my own profession didn't teach me all this stuff. But this hobby and this passion that I have is helping me learn quite a lot more about the world. Thank you so much, sir. It's a pleasure talking to you, and looking forward for the next time, sir. Jai Hind.
Pleasure entirely mine, David. So, thank you.